Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're here to break down the kind of complex research that really matters, giving you the core knowledge you need.
That's right.
And today, well, we've got a big one. We're tackling the final long-term results from a study that's shaped and maybe debated prostate cancer screening for decades.
We are. We're looking at the European randomized study of screening for prostate cancer, the ERSPC, and crucially, this is the definitive 23-year follow-up data.
23 years, that's a long time in medicine.
It really is. And it means this isn't just, another update. It feels more like the final word on a trial that's been influencing practice since the early 90s.
And the timing feels critical, doesn't it? Why is getting this final answer on PSA screening so important right now?
Well, the global picture for prostate cancer is, frankly, alarming. Our sources are projecting that the number of deaths worldwide could actually double by 2040.
Double. Wow. Is the cancer itself getting worse?
Not necessarily more aggressive, no. It's more about demographics. People are living longer, populations are growing, especially in developing nations.
Right. So more men are living into the age range where prostate cancer becomes more common, even the slow-growing types.
Exactly. And that puts immense pressure on public health systems. We desperately need to know if early detection tools like the PSA test can actually make a dent in that projected increase. Can organized screening help? That's the core question.
And ERSTC is our best guide. It started way back, 1993, right?
That's right, 1993. And it was huge. Over 162,000 men randomized between 55 and 69 years old.
So for you listening, here's our mission today. We're using this final 23-year data to figure out definitively, does organized PSA screening save lives? And maybe just as importantly, what's the cost? What's that updated harm-benefit ratio look like now?
And the headline, what does this massive data set tell us after all this time?
Well, there are two key things.
Okay.
First, it confirms what earlier reports suggested. There is a sustained long-term reduction in deaths from prostate cancer with screening. So, yes, a benefit.
That's the big one.
But the second point is maybe more nuanced, but really interesting. The harm-to-benefit ratio seems to have actually improved over the longer term. It looks better at 23 years than it did at 16 years.
Improved, right. That's crucial. The trade-off looks more favorable with more time.
But, there's always a trade-off in medicine. Nothing's free.
Yeah.
So what's the fundamental challenge here? What's the cost we're talking about?
The cost, the harm, it boils down to one main thing with prostate cancer screening: overdiagnosis.
Finding cancers that wouldn't have actually caused a problem.
Precisely. Detecting cancers, often very small, low-grade ones, that were never going to threaten the man's life or even cause symptoms. And that overdiagnosis often leads to overtreatment surgery, radiation with potential side effects for cancer that didn't need treating.
So it's that constant balancing act, saving lives versus potentially harming men through unnecessary diagnosis and treatment.
That's the tightrope. And that essential tension is what this deep dive is all about, untangling using this final ERSPC data.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the study itself. The sheer scale and complexity here are kind of mind-boggling. This wasn't some neat little trial run in one hospital.
Oh, definitely not. It was a massive undertaking. We're talking multi-center, randomized across 8 different European countries. Think about that. Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Italy, Spain, Switzerland. Even 2 centers in France initially.
Coordinating that across different healthcare systems must have been a nightmare.
I imagine so. But it also gives the results a certain real-world robustness,
And the core group, just to reiterate, 162,236 men aged 55 to 69 when they were randomized. How did they split them up?
It was a standard randomized controlled trial design. Men were randomly assigned to one of 2 groups, either the screening group, they were actively invited for PSA testing at regular intervals, well, semi-regular as we'll see,
Okay.
or the control group. And they were specifically not invited for screening as part of the study.
Yeah.
The idea was to compare an organized program against sort of the background rate of what happens anyway.
Right. Now, the protocols, this is where it gets messy, isn't it? You mentioned standardization. They used the same PSA test, the Hybridtech one.
Yes, the assay itself was standardized, which is good. But beyond that, lots of variation, particularly around the PSA cutoff level used to trigger a biopsy recommendation.
What was the typical cutoff?
Most centers, the majority, use 3.0 nanograms per milliliter. That's the number you often hear about. If your PSA was 3.0 or higher, they generally recommend a biopsy.
But not all of them.
No. Finland and Italy, for example, they used a higher threshold, 4.0 in GML.
Okay, so right there, a different approach.
And it wasn't always just the PSA number. especially for men in that intermediate range, say between 3.0 and 3.9. Some centers added other tests. Finland used digital rectal exams, DREs, early on, and later the free to total PSA ratio to help decide. Italy did similar things.
So the screening intervention wasn't really one single thing. It was more like a collection of slightly different protocols under one umbrella.
Exactly. It reflects the real world, where practice varies. And the screening intervals, how often they tested the men, that varied wildly too.
Right, I saw that. That must have a big impact.
Huge impact. Most centers used a 4-year interval. That became the sort of standard ERSPC interval.
Okay.
But then you had Sweden and the French centers that were later excluded using a 2-year interval. Much more intensive screening.
Twice as often.
Yep. And at the other extreme, Belgium used a 7-year interval, much less frequent.
Wow, 2 years versus 7 years. What does that imply for the results?
Well, a 2-year interval is likely to pick up more cancers earlier, including potentially more of those slow-growing, low-risk ones. So maybe higher overdiagnosis risk, but also maybe catching aggressive cancers sooner.
And the 7-year interval?
Less burden, fewer tests, probably less detection of indolent cancers immediately. But maybe you risk missing a window for cure if a cancer grows quickly between tests. The fact that the overall ERSPC result averages across these different intensities is really important to remember. It's not the result of one specific frequency.
Definitely. Okay, let's talk about France. You mentioned the French centers were excluded from the main analysis. Why was that? They had quite a few men, right?
They did, around 30,000. But they had issues with meeting the study's quality criteria. Primarily, adherence was low. Fewer than 50% of the men invited for screening actually participated. And maybe even more critically, compliance with getting a biopsy after a positive PSA test was also poor. If the intervention arm isn't actually getting the intervention, you can't really measure its effect accurately in a randomized trial.
Makes sense. Plus, didn't they start later?
Yes, they started recruitment later, so they had shorter follow-up time compared to the other centers, which also made it difficult to contribute meaningfully to the 23-year mortality outcomes, given how long it takes for benefits to show.
Right, that long delay we talked about. You also touched on different randomization methods, Zellen-type versus volunteer-based. Can you unpack that a bit? Sounds technical, but does it matter?
It does matter for interpretation, yeah. The Zellen approach, which Sweden, Finland, and Italy used, randomizes men first and then seeks consent from those in the screening group.
Okay, why do it that way?
It aims to measure the effect of offering screening to a whole population, capturing the real-world impact, including noncompliance. It measures program effectiveness.
Got it. And the other way?
Volunteer-based, used in the other centers. Men consent first, and then only those who agree are randomized. This measures efficacy more directly, the effect among men who are willing to be screened.
So the final ERSPC result is a mix of both, program effectiveness and efficacy among volunteers.
Pretty much. It reflects both the potential benefit if everyone complies and the actual benefit you get in a population where uptake isn't perfect. It adds another layer of complexity to the overall result.
Okay, moving on to how they figured out who died from prostate cancer. That seems crucial, given men in this age group die from lots of things.
Absolutely critical. They had a very rigorous process initially. Independent committees, both local and international, reviewed the cause of death for any man diagnosed with prostate cancer. Importantly, these committees were blinded. They didn't know if the man was in the screening or control group. To avoid bias, they used a standardized algorithm.
Sounds robust.
It was. Interestingly, in Finland and Sweden, they later found that the committee decisions matched the causes listed on official death certificates so well that they eventually just used the death certificates. That actually validates the quality of those national registries, at least for prostate cancer.
And the main analysis approach, you mentioned intention to screen.
Yes, always intention to screen in a big trial like this. You compare the groups as they were originally randomized, everyone offered screening, versus everyone not offered screening. Doesn't matter if someone in the screening group refused or if someone in the control group went and got a PSA test on their own.
Why is that so important?
It gives you the most unbiased estimate of what happens if you actually implement this screening program in the real world. With all its imperfections like non-compliance and contamination, it reflects the practical impact.
All right, let's get to the heart of it. 23 years later, what did they find? Did offering screening actually reduce deaths from prostate cancer?
Yes. The primary outcome, prostate cancer mortality, was definitively lower in the group offered screening.
How much lower?
The rate of death was 13% lower in the screening group compared to the control group. That gives a rate ratio, or RR, of 0.87. And this was statistically significant. The confidence interval was 0.80 to 0.95, so a clear effect.
13%. That sounds good, but how does that translate into actual lives saved? We need the absolute numbers for public health.
Exactly. The absolute risk reduction, the ARR, is key here. Over the full 23 years, the ARR was 0.22%.
0.22%. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms? For, say, every 1,000 men.
It means that for every 1,000 men who were invited into the screening program, roughly 2.2 deaths from prostate cancer were prevented over those 23 years.
So invite 1,000 men, screen many of them over years, and you prevent about 2 deaths. That's the tangible benefit.
That's the population-level benefit of the invitation to screen. Now, if you adjust for the fact that not everyone invited actually got screened.
Right, you mentioned about 83% participated at least once.
Yes. If you correct for that non-attendance and estimate the effect only among those who were screened, the relative risk reduction goes up slightly to 16%. The rate ratio becomes 0.84.
So higher compliance means a slightly bigger mortality reduction. Makes sense.
It does. But that 13% overall figure is probably the more realistic one for planning a public health program, because you'll always have some non-participation.
Now, this is fascinating how this benefit unfolded over time. You hinted that it takes a while. Can we trace that?
We really have to. It's fundamental to understanding PSA screening. The benefit is heavily backloaded. Let's look at the milestones from the study, referencing their Table 2 data roughly.
Okay.
At the 9-year follow-up point, way back when, they saw a relative reduction of about 17%. But the absolute risk reduction, tiny, only 0.05%.
So after almost a decade of screening, biopsies, anxiety, very few deaths were actually prevented at that point.
Almost negligible on a population scale. The intervention needed more time. Then jump forward to the 16-year report. The relative reduction was similar, around 18%, but the absolute risk reduction had climbed to 0.16%. Better, but still not huge.
And now at 23 years.
The relative reduction is 13%, so it's stabilized or slightly decreased relative-wise, but the absolute benefit has continued to grow. The ARR is now 0.22%.
Okay, so the gap in actual death prevented keeps widening over time, even if the percentage reduction looks stable.
Exactly. The core lesson is crystal clear. Any significant mortality benefit from PSA screening takes a long time to show up. It's minimal in the first decade, but it steadily increases after that.
Which implies?
It implies that screening is really only potentially beneficial for men who have a pretty long life expectancy ahead of them. Right? You need to live long enough, probably 15 years or more after starting screening, to actually reap that mortality benefit. It's a long-term investment.
That makes sense. Did they check if the groups were otherwise healthy? Did screening affect death from other causes?
Crucial check. And no, it didn't. The cumulative mortality from other causes at 23 years was virtually identical in both groups, around 49%. The risk ratio was exactly 1.00.
So screening didn't make men live longer overall or die sooner from other things. It specifically targeted prostate cancer deaths.
Correct. It confirms the groups were a comparable baseline, and the intervention's effect was specific to prostate cancer. That strengthens the findings.
Now, there's a caveat, right? You mentioned contamination in the control group. Could the actual benefit of screening be even higher than 13%?
That's a really important methodological point. Yes, it's likely underestimated. Remember, the control group men weren't invited to study screening, but they lived in countries with PSA testing available. Some inevitably got tested by their own doctors, opportunistic screening.
And if the control group is getting some screening,
their mortality rate from prostate cancer will be lower than a truly unscreened population. So when you compare the official screening group to this contaminated control group, the difference between them looks smaller.
the 13% reduction might actually be dampened down because the comparison group wasn't purely no screening.
Precisely. We know this contamination happened, particularly in the Finnish, Dutch, and Swedish centers. So the true benefit of a well-organized screening program compared to absolutely no screening is probably somewhat larger than the 13% reported here.
Okay, benefit established, benefit likely underestimated. Now let's flip the coin and look hard at the harms, the big one being overdiagnosis. What did the incidence data show? How many extra cancers were found?
The incidence data paints a very clear picture. Over the 23 years, the total number of prostate cancers diagnosed was significantly higher in the screening group. It was 14% cumulative incidence in the screening arm versus 12% in the control arm.
Okay, 14% versus 12%. What's that as a rate ratio?
That gives a rate ratio of 1.30. So about a 30% higher chance of being diagnosed if you were in the screening group.
And in absolute terms, how many extra diagnoses per 1,000 men.
It works out to an absolute excess incidence of 27 cases per 1,000 men invited for screening.
27 extra men diagnosed per 1,000 screened. And these are potentially the overdiagnosed cases.
That's the pool, yes. These are men who likely would have lived their whole lives without ever knowing they had prostate cancer if it weren't for the screening program picking it up. That's the core harm diagnosing potentially insignificant disease.
Did they look at what kind of cancers were being found in excess? Was it the dangerous kind or the less worrying kind?
This is perhaps the most revealing part of the harm analysis. They stratified the cancers by risk group using standard classifications, and the results were stark.
Okay.
For low-risk cancers, the ones least likely to cause problems, the risk ratio was 2.14.
Wow, so screening doubled the detection rate of low-risk cancers.
More than doubled, yes. That's where the vast majority of the overdiagnosis seems to be happening, finding lots more indolent disease.
What about the more aggressive cancers, high-risk or advanced ones?
Completely different story. For high-risk cancers, the risk ratio is 0.95. Basically, no difference in detection rates between the groups.
So screening wasn't finding more high-risk cancers?
Not significantly more, no. And for advanced prostate cancer at diagnosis, the rate ratio is 0.66. So screening actually reduced the detection of already advanced disease, which makes sense if you're catching things earlier.
Okay, so pulling that together, the main impact of screening on incidence was finding a whole lot more low-risk cancers while not really increasing the detection of high-risk ones and reducing advanced ones.
That's the pattern. It strongly suggests that the benefit of screening comes from catching potentially aggressive cancers earlier, leading to the mortality reduction, but the cost is primarily finding many low-risk cancers that likely didn't need finding.
Beyond the diagnosis itself, there's the process, the testing, the biopsies. That's a harm too, right? The burden of the procedures.
Absolutely, it's not trivial. First, think about the PSA tests themselves. Across the whole study, only about 17% of all the PSA tests done actually came back positive or elevated enough to trigger further action.
So 83% of the tests were negative, which is good, but still involved a blood draw, maybe some waiting, some anxiety.
Exactly. Then, for the 17% who did have a positive test, they were typically referred for a biopsy. Compliance was pretty high. About 89% of men recommended for biopsy went through with it.
Okay, but what did those biopsies find?
Here's the kicker. Only 24% of the biopsies performed actually confirmed a prostate cancer diagnosis.
Only 1 in 4.
Roughly, yes. So think about that. For every 4 men who underwent an invasive transrectal ultrasound-guided prostate biopsy, which isn't a pleasant procedure, 3 of them did not have cancer found.
3 unnecessary biopsies for everyone that found cancer. And those biopsies got more invasive over time.
They did. The standard practice evolved during the study. Early on, maybe 6 biopsy cores were taken. Later, it became common to take 10 or 12 cores. More cores mean a slightly higher chance of finding cancer, but also more discomfort and a higher risk of complications like infection or bleeding.
So there's this significant burden of false positive tests leading to unnecessary invasive procedures with their own risks and discomforts. That's a big part of the harm side of the equation.
It's a huge part. It's the immediate, tangible downside for many men involved in screening. For every one man whose life is ultimately saved years down the line, dozens of others go through the ringer of testing, anxiety, false alarms, and unnecessary procedures. That reality really shapes the discussion about how to screen better.
Okay, we've got the benefit lives saved, eventually. We've got the harms over diagnosis, unnecessary procedures. How do we put this together? We need those summary stats, right? The NNI and NND.
Yes, the number needed to invote, NNI, and the number needed to diagnose, NND. These are really the bottom line metrics for judging the trade-off.
Remind us what they mean again.
Sure. NNI, number needed to invite, is how many men you need to invite into your screening program to prevent one single death from prostate cancer over the study period. It reflects the population effort.
Got it. Invite X men to save 1 life. And NND.
NND, number needed to diagnose, tells you how many men need to be diagnosed with prostate cancer, including all those potentially overdiagnosed cases, to achieve that one prevented death. It reflects the diagnostic cost, if you like.
Okay, NNI is population cost, NND is diagnostic cost per life saved. So what are the final 23-year numbers from ERSPC?
At 23 years, the NNI is 456.
So invite 456 men for screening over the years to prevent 1 prostate cancer death.
Correct, and the NND is 12.
Meaning, for every 12 men diagnosed with prostate cancer through the screening program, 1 death was ultimately averted.
Exactly. So 1 life saved, but at the cost of 11 other diagnoses, many of which, as we saw, were likely low risk and potentially overdiagnosed.
How does that NNI of 456 compare? Is that considered good or bad for a screening program?
It's in the ballpark for some other cancer screening programs, maybe a bit less efficient than, say, certain types of colorectal cancer screening. But the really important comparison isn't against other diseases, it's against the ERSPC's own earlier results.
Ah, right. You said the ratio improved. See that. How did the 23-year numbers compare to the 16-year numbers?
The improvement is quite striking. At the 16-year follow-up point, the NNI was 628.
628, okay.
Now, at 23 years, it's dropped to 456.
Wow, that's a big drop. Almost 200 fewer men needed per life saved just by following them longer.
It's a substantial improvement in efficiency. And the same trend holds for the NND. At 16 years, the NND was 18.
18 diagnoses per life saved.
And now at 23 years, it's down to 12.
Again, a significant improvement. Less diagnostic cost per life saved. What's driving this mathematical improvement over time?
It comes back to the slow nature of the disease and the delayed benefit. The number of deaths prevented the numerator in the calculation kept ticking up steadily between year 16 and year 23 as men diagnosed earlier reached the age where the cancer might have killed them without intervention.
Okay, the benefit side kept growing.
Right. But the number of new excess diagnoses being generated by screening the overdiagnosis component, the denominator started to level off. Remember that excess incidence rate? It didn't climb much further after year 16.
So more lives saved, but the rate of finding extra cancers slowed down relative to that.
Exactly. The benefit continued to mature, while the harm component, new overdiagnoses, stabilized relative to the growing cohort size and follow-up time. That combination mathematically improves the NNI and NND ratios.
That's a critical insight. It means you have to accept a pretty unfavorable harm-benefit ratio early on in a PSA screening program.
You absolutely do. For the first 10-15 years, the numbers might look quite poor.
Knowing that it should theoretically get better if you stick with it long enough for the mortality benefit to fully emerge.
That's the key takeaway for policy. You need long-term commitment and understanding that the payoff isn't immediate. Short-term evaluations of PSA screening can be quite misleading.
Okay. The need for long life expectancy to see the benefit logically leads to the next question. When should we stop screening? Is there an age where it's no longer helpful or maybe even harmful? Did ERSPC look at this?
Yes, they did a really important secondary analysis focusing on the older men, the ones who reached the upper age limit for screening specified in their center's protocol.
What was that upper limit generally?
It varied a bit, but the median age when men stopped protocol screening was around 72. This analysis looked at about 72% of the original screening group, the ones who were still alive and hadn't been diagnosed with prostate cancer by that age.
And the question was, does the protection from their earlier screening carry on, and is there any point continuing to screen beyond that age?
Exactly. They tracked these men after they aged out of the protocol. What they found was, initially, yes, there was a sustained protective effect. The hazard ratio for dying from prostate cancer remained lower for a while in the men who had previously been screened compared to controls of the same age.
Okay, so some lingering benefit.
But, and this is the crucial part, the benefit wasn't permanent. It gradually waned the longer it had been since their last screen.
How quickly did it fade? Was there a point where the protection disappeared?
Yes. They looked at the confidence intervals around the hazard ratio. The upper boundary crossed 1.0, meaning no statistically significant difference anymore, roughly 6 years after the men passed that upper age limit, that median age of 72.
So if you stopped screening at 72, by about 78, the protective effect from your previous screening was likely gone.
That's what the data suggests, yes. The benefit seems to have a limited shelf life when screening stops.
Why would it fade relatively quickly like that? It took over a decade to build up.
The main driver is competing risks. You have to look at the health profile of men in their mid to late 70s and beyond.
Okay.
First, their absolute risk of actually dying from prostate cancer, if they haven't been diagnosed by then, is pretty low. In this specific subgroup of older, previously screened men, the incidence of lethal prostate cancer was only about 0.71% over the next 12 years. Very low.
So not many men in that group are destined to die of prostate cancer anyway.
Correct. But their risk of dying from other things, heart disease, stroke, other cancers, pneumonia, you name it, is much, much higher. In this older subgroup, the other cause mortality was around 45% over that follow-up period.
45% dying from other causes versus less than 1% dying from prostate cancer.
Exactly. That's a massive competing risk. If you're much more likely to die of something else soon, any potential benefit from detecting prostate cancer early becomes statistically tiny, potentially zero.
And continuing to screen these older men presumably carries a higher risk of...
Overdiagnosis, definitely. We know older men have a higher underlying prevalence of slow-growing, indolent prostate cancers. Screening a 75 or 80-year-old is very likely to find one of these cancers that would never have bothered him.
leading to potential anxiety, unnecessary biopsies, and maybe even treatments with side effects that could ruin his quality of life in his remaining years.
Precisely the concern. The risk of harm from overdiagnosis and subsequent overtreatment likely outweighs the very small chance of benefit for most men in that older age group.
So this ERSPC analysis really backs up current guidelines, doesn't it? The ones that say stop screening around 70, 75, or if life expectancy is limited.
It provides strong, direct evidence for those recommendations. Most guidelines suggest stopping routine screening for men over 70, or certainly for those with less than a 10-15-year life expectancy. This data shows why.
Yet you mentioned that in reality, a lot of older men are still getting screened.
Yes, the sources noted the disconnect. Estimates suggest up to 40% of U.S. men aged 75 and older might still be undergoing PSA screening. This ERSPC data really underscores that for the average man, continuing routine screening much beyond the early 70s is probably not a good idea. The harms likely outweigh the benefits.
Okay, ERSPC gives us this really solid, long-term European data showing a benefit, albeit with harms. How does this fit with other major trials, particularly the big U.S. one, PLCO, which famously found no benefit?
Ah, yes, the PLCO trial. The comparison is crucial because for years it created so much confusion. PLCO, the prostate, lung, colorectal, and ovarian cancer screening trial in the U.S., reported no significant reduction in prostate cancer mortality with screening.
Leading to very different recommendations in the U.S. versus Europe for a long time.
Exactly. But we now understand that the PLCO result wasn't really a fair comparison of screening versus no screening.
Why not? What was the issue?
The issue was massive contamination in the control group. Men who were assigned to the usual care arm, who were supposed to represent the unscreened population, ended up getting PSA tests anyway outside the trial protocol.
How many of them?
Estimates vary, but it's thought that upwards of 80%, maybe even higher by the end of the trial, of the men in the PLCO control group had received at least one PSA test.
80%. So you weren't comparing screening to no screening at all?
Not even close. You were basically comparing an organized screening group to a group getting widespread, disorganized, opportunistic screening. When both groups are getting screened to a large extent, it washes out any difference in mortality between them.
It masks the true effect.
Completely masks it. In fact, when researchers have tried to model the PLCO data and adjust for that massive contamination, their estimates suggest that PLCO might have shown a mortality reduction somewhere in the range of 27% to 32% if the control group had been truly unscreened.
Which is actually even higher than the ERSPC's 13%.
Potentially, yes. So ironically, the negative PLCO trial, once you account for contamination, might actually support an even stronger benefit for screening than ERSPC does. It validates the principle.
What about the UK trial, the CAP trial? What did that add?
The CAP trial, cluster randomized trial of PSA testing for prostate cancer, had a different design. It primarily tested the effect of a single invitation for a PSA test, along with nurse-led follow-up compared to usual care.
Just one test invite.
Predominantly, yes. And after about 15 years of follow-up, they found only a modest 8% relative reduction in mortality, which wasn't statistically significant in their main analysis.
So much less impact than ERSPC.
Right. And the lesson there, especially when you put it next to ERSPC, seems to be about intensity and compliance. The ERSPC protocol involved repeated screening over many years and had generally higher uptake. The CRAP trial suggests that a one-off screening invitation probably isn't enough to make a major dent in mortality. You need sustained, repeated screening for those benefits to accrue.
Okay, so synthesizing all this, ERSPC shows a clear sustained benefit with repeated screening. PLCO likely confirms this once contamination is considered, and CAP suggests one-off screening isn't enough. The takeaway isn't don't screen, it's screen smarter.
Exactly. That's the overwhelming conclusion from the 23-year ERSPC data and the broader trial landscape. We know PSA screening can work, but the old approach, just testing everyone regularly and biopsying everyone with a raised PSA, causes too much harm through overdiagnosis. The future has to be about risk-based targeted screening.
How do we do that? How do we maintain the benefit finding the dangerous cancers while slashing the harm of finding the harmless ones?
We need better tools to decide who needs a biopsy. The old pathway was too crude. High PSA wings biopsy. The new pathway needs filters.
What kind of filter?
First, using better risk assessment before even deciding on next steps. Incorporating things like family history, ethnicity, maybe other biomarkers into risk calculators. These can tell us if a man with a slightly elevated PSA is actually at high or low risk of having an aggressive cancer. If his risk is low, maybe we just monitor his PSA, we don't jump to biopsy.
Okay, risk calculators first. What else?
The big game changer is magnetic resonance imaging MRI, multiparametric MRI of the prostate.
How does MRI fit in?
It acts as a crucial intermediate step, so the pathway becomes elevated PSA, maybe combined with high-risk score, leads to an MRI scan before any biopsy.
And the MRI tells you?
The MRI can visualize the prostate gland in great detail. It can often distinguish between areas that look highly suspicious for significant cancer and areas that look normal or have low-risk changes. If the MRI is negative or shows only low-risk features, you might avoid a biopsy altogether. If it shows a clear suspicious lesion, then you proceed to a targeted biopsy, aiming directly at that suspicious spot.
How does that MRI filter help with the ERSPC harms the overdiagnosis and unnecessary biopsies?
It tackles both. First, by avoiding biopsies when the MRI is clear, it directly reduces the number of unnecessary invasive procedures and their complications. That's a huge win.
Right.
Second, many of those very small, low-grade, indolent cancers, the ones driving the overdiagnosis problem, are often invisible on MRI. So using MRI as a gatekeeper tends to filter out a lot of the clinically insignificant disease, reducing the overdiagnosis rate.
So you find fewer harmless cancers and do fewer unnecessary biopsies, but hopefully still pick up the dangerous ones.
That's the goal. And early results from trials using MRI and the diagnostic pathway are really promising. They show exactly that. Fewer biopsies, fewer low-grade cancer diagnoses, but maintained or even improved detection of the high-grade, clinically significant cancers that actually need treatment.
And even when screening does find a low-risk cancer, we have better options now than just aggressive treatment, right? Something the ERSPC participants didn't really have back in the 90s.
Absolutely critical point. The rise of active surveillance, AS, has fundamentally changed the landscape. Back when ERSPC started, if screening found cancer, the default was usually surgery or radiation, regardless of risk.
Which caused significant side effects for many men with harmless cancers.
Exactly. Today, for men diagnosed with low-risk, localized prostate cancer, precisely the kind most likely to be overdiagnosed by screening active surveillance, is the standard recommendation.
Which involves?
Close monitoring, regular PSA tests, repeat imaging like MRI, maybe occasional repeat biopsies, but no immediate treatment. You only intervene with curative intent if there's clear evidence the cancer is progressing or becoming more aggressive.
So AS breaks the link between diagnosis and immediate treatment harm.
It decouples them for low-risk disease. This is huge. It means that even if screening finds an indolent cancer, overdiagnosis, AS prevents the overtreatment harm. It allows us to capture the mortality benefit of screening while mitigating its biggest downside. The existence of AS makes the overall proposition of screening much more palatable than it was 20 years ago.
Does the ERSPC data give any clues about optimizing the screening interval? How often should men be tested?
It offers some hints towards risk-adapting the interval, too. The data strongly suggests that a man's baseline PSA level, say at age 60, is highly predictive of his long-term risk.
Oh, so?
Men who had a very low PSA at baseline, the study mentions perhaps 1.0 NGML or less at age 60, had an extremely low risk of dying from prostate cancer over the next couple of decades.
So for those very low-risk men?
Maybe they don't need screening every 4 years until age 70. Perhaps you could screen them much less frequently, or even stop screening them altogether much earlier, without losing much, if any, benefit.
Tailoring the frequency based on initial risk.
Exactly. It's another way to make screening more efficient. Focus the resources and the burden of testing on the men who are actually at higher risk and stand to benefit most, while safely reducing the intensity for those at very low risk. That's also part of the smarter screening future. #ouch.
Wow, that was a comprehensive journey through 23 years of data. Let's try and boil it down. What are the absolute key takeaways for someone listening?
Okay, if I had to pick 3 core nuggets from this final ERSPC report. 1. The benefit is real and sustained. Organized, repeated PSA screening does lead to a reduction in prostate cancer mortality, around 13% relative reduction over the long term. That's confirmed.
Okay, benefit confirmed.
2. The harm-benefit trade-off gets better over time. The number needed to invite significantly improved, dropping from 628 at 16 years to 456 at 23 years. It becomes more efficient with longer follow-up.
Trade-off improves. Got it.
And 3, the primary harm remains overdiagnosis, specifically doubling the detection of low-risk cancers. But crucially, modern medicine with tools like MRI and active surveillance now gives us much better ways to manage and mitigate that specific harm.
Benefit real, trade-off improving, harm manageable with new tools. That feels like a more optimistic picture than maybe we had 10 years ago.
I think it is. The ERPC laid the groundwork, showing what screening could achieve, warts and all. And now, technological and management advances are showing us how to potentially achieve that benefit much more safely and efficiently.
So what's the ultimate impact of this long-term data likely to be on clinical guidelines and policy?
It solidifies the case that screening, when done well in the right age group, roughly 55-69, is effective, but it strongly pushes the implementation towards these smarter, risk-adapted approaches. It basically says, the principle works, now let's use MRI, risk calculators, and active surveillance to do it right, minimizing the collateral damage.
Which leaves us, as always, with the final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
Indeed, we saw that the mortality benefit really kicks in after 10-15 years. We also saw that the control group mortality in ERSPC, even at 23 years, was only 1.5%, maybe lower than expected, perhaps due to that contamination.
Okay.
Now, consider that many of the men who started this trial in their late 50s are only now entering their late 70s or early 80s. The peak age for prostate cancer death is typically over 80. So, is it possible that even this 23-year follow-up is still underestimating the true, full, lifetime benefit of screening for those younger participants? Could the mortality curves diverge even further in the next 5 or 10 years?
The final chapter might not even be written yet for the cohort itself.
Possibly not entirely. And if the full benefit takes 25, maybe 30 years to become completely apparent, how do you convince health systems and policymakers often focused on much shorter time horizons, like election cycles or 5-year budgets, to invest in and sustain an organized screening program whose biggest payoff might be decades down the road?
That is a challenge, balancing long-term public health gains against short-term costs and political cycles. A tough question indeed. Thank you for walking us through this incredibly important study.
My pleasure. It's crucial data to understand.